Right, let's try this again. Let me see if... Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Oh, there we go. I am going to invite... Hi, everyone that's joining us. We appreciate you logging on in the middle of the day on a Wednesday. We appreciate all the love and support. Maria, you've joined us. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm not as tech savvy as I consider myself to be, but yeah, I tried to start it earlier and I had a few hiccups, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we were able to connect for today's
Yeah, me
conversation.
too.
Yeah,
I'm so
so
happy to be here. Thank you so much for asking me to join this conversation.
no,
I
yeah.
have your artwork in the background.
Yeah. I had to, I always get nervous, when it comes to doing this celebration because, we have so many things going on. But yesterday, every artist that was interested came by and we were already closed and people were still dropping off artwork. So I had to show, one of the
Wow.
latest pieces to get dropped off. But yeah, thank you. Thank you again. We appreciate you joining us. And a big shout out to all of the viewers. I see that people are coming in later on in the conversation. We are going to have, a few minutes for questions. So feel free to drop something in the comments. If I don't overlook it, feel free to remind me. I always need to get hounded just because my attention span isn't the best. But yeah, again, thank you. And without further ado, I think we should go ahead and get started because I think we have a lot to discuss. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. I'm Rafael Tamayo. I'm the manager here of the Oak Cliff Cultural Center. We're a division of the City of Dallas Office of Arts and Culture. And I'm very excited because this conversation today is the official kickoff for the 214 Selena Festival that we do annually, presented by the Oak Cliff Cultural Center. And if you're unfamiliar with us, I invite you to visit our website at occc.dallasculture.org. You can learn a little more about who we are and what we do. And just a little bit of information, the 214 Selena Festival began as a party celebrating the memory of the one and only Selena by the Sour Grapes Art Collective and the Faded DJs crew. Shout out to the OG DJ Trino of the Faded family. But in honoring that legacy, the party and celebration grew to so many other things just because the community showed up and they said, hey, this is amazing. This is really cool to see. We want to see more of it. And so now it's a 5-day festival of things all over Oak Cliff and Dallas. So we're really excited to be able to do things like the conversation we have today. And to officially get the celebration started, I have the honor of welcoming our special guest for today's conversation. Maria Garcia is the executive editor of Futuro Studios, where she oversees long form narrative podcasts. She is also the host and creator of the critically acclaimed podcast Anything for Selena, which was named one of the best podcasts of the year by The Atlantic, Vulture, Time, Vogue, and many more. I think it was the Apple Podcast of the Year for 2021 too, right?
It
I,
was,
I
yeah.
yeah, I feel like that list is so long, but props,
Mhm.
and we'll get into that too.
Thank you.
Maria was also named Podcast Newcomer of the Year by Apple Podcasts in 2021. She has edited and helped helm other award winning podcasts like The Sum of Us and season 2 of La Brega, which was named one of the best podcasts of the year by the New York Times and The New Yorker. Whew. Maria, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Hi, I'm so
Hi.
excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I always get nervous of making sure that we do justice by the people that we work with, the people that we invite to be a part of some of the programs that we do. And in trying to kind of give a glimpse into who you are and what you've done, I found it pretty challenging because I was like, oh man, this is one thing. And we could really go into talking about what this means and how the community accepted it and embraced it and what it means to our culture at large. And so I ended up going down several rabbit holes about everything that you've done in such a short period of time, with things like the podcast. So I hope we did you justice in the intro,
Oh
but
my God. Yeah, yeah. I always feel so like weird in intros, you know. It's always like slightly uncomfortable when, you know, people are introducing you and talking about everything you've done. But yeah, thank you so much.
no, of course, no. And I mean, it's not easy to kind of, we here at Oak Cliff Cultural Center, we work with a lot of artists and creatives, and a lot of the time we request that they provide artist statements. We have to push some of our creatives to toot their own horn and really brag on themselves. And it can be difficult, but at the same time, I think as a cultural center, we find it within our job description to say, hey, we're champions of what you do. It's amazing. It's great work. So help us help you and really like amplify what it is that you're doing in whatever case it is, right? So yeah, so I was happy to kind of pull some information together and looking forward to this discussion. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Well, let's get into it. I think the you heard a little bit about what we do with the 214 Selena Festival. And again, it started off as a party with some DJs and the Sour Grapes Art Collective. A big shout out to Arturo Don Juan, Arma, with all of that. But really, it was a night of cumbias, celebrating who Selena was and what she meant to so many of us. And even within our community, that perspective varies, right? What she means to a older generation, a younger generation, someone who just likes to dance. What was your main driver behind the Anything for Selena podcast?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. By the way, I feel like I'm a little dark now. Let me like move a little bit, see if maybe you can see me a little better there.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, so you know, I have been a lifelong Selena fan, like since I was a child, like so many of us. I'm a millennial, an older millennial, and so I was a child in the 90s, and I grew up on the border in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And Selena was like in the air. She was everywhere when I was growing up as a fronteriza. People ask me all the time, like, when do you remember learning about Selena? And I'm like, I grew up in West Texas. We just like Selena was everywhere. There was no like learning about Selena because Selena was like breathing
Yeah.
air.
Yeah.
But I do remember the first time that like I really sort of like took note of her.
Hmm.
And I was a child and I was watching television with my parents and she was being interviewed. And I remember taking note of the way she spoke.
Hmm.
I remember taking note of her Spanglish and her accent and the cadence of her words because it was so anomalous and really rare to see somebody who had sort of an accent similar to mine, who spoke with the same sort of like rhythmic cadence on like national television. That's just like what in the United States and in Mexico.
Right.
You know, people talk all the time about, oh my God, Selena was like about to cross over into the United States. That's a given. Like, that's not
Yeah.
surprising. Like, that we, all of us who knew her and followed her, um, knew that was going to happen. And that
Yeah.
was so natural because she was, you know, an American teen. But the crossover that really stayed with me, the crossover that in my mind is more impressive, is the crossover she made in Mexico. You know, for a
Hmm.
Mexican American who did not speak great Spanish to cross over and be accepted and be beloved and be taken in as authentically 100% Mexican, that was more meaningful than, you know, the upcoming American uh, crossover because that was sort of unheard of, right? For a Chicano, you know, what they derogatory call folks is like pochos,
Hmm.
to be viewed and fully embraced as fully Mexican in Mexico by Mexicans. That was unprecedented. And so yeah, that stayed with me, and it stayed with me as a child. It stayed with me as a teenager, and I just like always loved her. I grew up reading and consuming all the media about her. And of course, every year on sort of these key dates, like I'm sorry if you can hear my pug, by the way.
Uh, it's okay.
My pug Chalino is behind me chewing
Your
his little
pug's name is
bone.
Chalino?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Oh,
awesome. We love
I
dogs.
love
We're dog people here,
I'll
so.
have him.
Oh,
I'll have him teach.
Chalino.
This is Chelino. Oh, he's my best friend.
Oh.
Um, but like I grew up, consuming all of the media about her, and like there's these key dates, like the day she was born and the day of her death, obviously, where we get like a flurry of news coverage.
Mhm.
And it's all very similar. And I was craving both as her fan and also as a journalist. Like I was craving something of record that really did her legacy justice, that like went really deep and showed us how she transformed pop culture in America, how she transformed body politics and like what it looked like to belong in this country. And so that was my attempt with the podcast.
Well, I'll say on behalf of a large part of the community, I think you were successful in that, and I think there is a debt of gratitude for people like you, and specifically the way you articulate this information, because you're right. I mean, from my personal perspective, I grew up. My parents were undocumented immigrants. They're American citizens now, but that kind of upbringing was different than some of the later generations. And so I grew up not with the familiarity of Selena that a lot of my peers like in school had.
Hmm.
And so seeing that crossover in Mexico was very significant because early on, Selena, my mom didn't necessarily approve of Selena's outfits, much like her father. And so that was off putting enough to say, I'm not going to listen to her music. But then I think in the back of my mom's mind, when Selena did pass away, it was like, well, part of our community was taken away. Even though she's not necessarily like my cup of tea, she's still a member of my community. So let me see what all of this is about. And now, I mean, my mom's easily one of the biggest Selena fans ever. And so I think there had to be a conversation that happened with who is she? What does she represent? And how do I articulate within myself an understanding of what she represents in this like heavily nuanced culture of Mexican American, Chicano, Latinx. A West Coast Mexican is different than a Texan Mexican. Tejano music, all of these things that add just layers and layers of complexity to an already rich culture and heritage. What does it mean when someone like Selena comes in and does all of these things that are unprecedented, unheard of, and contribute so much to a culture that we are still kind of seeing inspiration from today. Um, and so yes, and I'll be honest with your podcast. When I heard the announcement of the Anything for Selena podcast, I was like, I feel like there's always that question of what route are they going to take, or A&E's doing a documentary, somebody else is going to try to find a different angle, and you're right, it does end up being the same. But I think when the very first episode of your podcast, it's like anyone who listens, they're like, oh, this is different. There is substance to this. This is going to be a deep dive. The fact that you're able to, even have a conversation with the father, with Abraham, like that's a huge deal, and it just shows the level of commitment to like who we are as a people, rather than hey, it's a date that's important to the Mexican American community. Let's do something that says, this is cool, or let's highlight someone that we know is popular. So again, thank you for. I mean, I don't feel like our appreciation will be enough with words, but thank you for the podcast, because it does really mean a lot in terms of nuance of who we are as a as a huge group of people.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. That is so meaningful to me. Thank you so much. And thank you to the folks joining. Thanks so much to Dan for his really kind comment, and Kelly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really was like a love letter. And I knew that the Selena stans were going to come out and they were going to evaluate, because I'm one of
Yeah.
them. And every time there's something new, I'm just like, you're just like naturally skeptical. And that's because, we guard Selena's legacy because Selena's legacy, in a way, is like our legacy, right?
Hmm.
Because so much of our identity as Mexican Americans is like tethered to hers, for so many reasons, that I go into in the podcast. But when Selena was coming up in the early 90s, it's so easy to forget what the media landscape was back then, right? Like now we're in the age of not just the internet, but like post internet, and like all the information is at our fingertips. And, Hollywood still has a ways to go, but there's definitely more Latinos and more Mexican and Mexican Americans out there in movies and film and shows. And that's wonderful. But when I was a little girl in the mid 90s, we had Selena and we had Blood In, Blood Out. Okay.
Yeah.
Like Mexican Americans. That's it.
Yes.
That's it. Okay. And so, and like there was this very white gazy way in which Mexicans were portrayed, right? Which was, either sort of like lost dropouts, or um teenage mothers, or the sort of like tragic gangsters. And here with Selena, with her sort of squeaky clean image. But besides that, it was Selena's sort of pride in her identity.
Hmm.
It's that Selena wasn't like succumbing to a white gaze, right? Selena wasn't like out there sort of like trying to convince white people that her culture was worthy and valuable. She wasn't even performing for the white gaze.
Right.
She was performing for the joy of her own people,
Hmm.
so she wasn't contorting herself to some sort of like white American expectation of Mexican American identity. She was simply like celebrating who she was, holding on to her roots, and saying like, there is value, there is beauty here, and I'm proud of it. And that in itself was like an incredibly subversive political statement
Hmm.
in the mid 90s. Her sheer existence, somebody who was an all American kid, right? And grew up in the US, grew up with major sort of American pop influences. Specifically, like she always paid homage to Black women artists,
Of course.
with
Yeah.
Taste of Honey and Whitney Houston and Janet Jackson, and always talked about how much they influenced her. So she was like an American teen through and through, right? But she was also an American teen who um, held on to her roots and held on to her identity without compromise, you know? And that was so subversive for the time. We're talking about the mid 90s, where, assimilation was so heavily indoctrinated into so many of us. And
Hmm.
here was Selena saying, like, no, I want to hold on to this identity. I'm not trying to be white. I'm not trying to be like a white American teen. I'm just trying to be who I genuinely am. And that was really powerful.
I appreciate you mentioning that because I think, when we do things like the 214 Selena Festival, but we see so many things happen around the memory and the legacy of who she was and the kind of contributions she made. Um, it's easy to overlook, and I don't know how to correctly frame this, but who she was and what she did in the course of her career was revolutionary. And a lot of the times when it comes to our revolutionary leaders in the community, it's easy to kind of disregard someone as not on the forefront of change or being an agent of change for our community because they're not necessarily out there protesting with picket signs and doing these, really radical and in your face kind of acts of activism. And Selena wasn't necessarily doing that. She wasn't shying away or, saying, I'm not a part of that. But what she was doing, and in the way that you were saying it, uncompromising her like existence as a woman, a Mexican American singer in American culture, because it was such an impactful position for her to be in. um, that means that she was a revolutionary, and that leads to all of the impact and ripple effects that we are seeing today. So with that in mind, how do you think that that's kind of affected where we are in culture when it comes to not just the Mexican American community, the Latinx community, and other communities that are not necessarily, or that wouldn't necessarily be directly tied to who Selena was? What do you think what do you think who she was and her contributions to culture mean in the sense of belonging in this country?
Yeah, I think, there are a few answers to that. So, one, let's sort of think about Selena and the way she carried herself, right? Her sheer sort of like presence,
Hmm.
aesthetics, existence, um, the crimson lips, the sort of pronounced gold hoops, the frizzy hair, which I'm donning right now. The sort of like embrace of like the frizzy textured hair, um the the sexy outfits, the sort of like tight, you know um the Hana outfits, all of that are markers of a Mexican American working class.
Mm.
All of those, all of those like aesthetic markers, they're symbols of a, a very specific sort of like tax bracket and the aesthetic that came with it. And at the time in the mid 90s, that that identity, that sort of like class belonging, the sort of like Mexican American working class was very derided. It was like made fun of. It was considered not classy,
Right.
uh, you know, tacky. Um, and, you here was Selena saying, like, no, actually, there's a lot of beauty here. There's a lot of beauty and meaning and heritage and worthiness in my gold hoops, in my defined, red lips, um, in my hair, in the definition of sexy that has been passed down by the working class women in my family. And so, what do you see as a young woman when suddenly these markers of identity that you see on yourself and your cousins, um, but that are kind of made fun of on the mainstream, right? And
Mhm.
magazines, and you're fed all these sort of messages that all of these aesthetic markers about your identity, um, they're kind of wrong and ugly, and that you should be sort of shrinking yourself, actually, shrinking instead of blooming into them. And suddenly you see a woman who's doing the opposite, who's sort of like refusing to succumb to that message. And instead of shrinking beneath all of the messages of mainstream white American society who are saying this look, this look is trashy, this look, there's no sort of like aesthetic merit to this look. She's wearing it like art,
Yeah.
you know, and um, that then gives you permission as a young woman to wear those things, to sort of like don, um, your crimson lips, your big hoops, your frizzy hair, and to say like, well, actually, there is a ton of beauty in this. And you know, I when I was a child, I didn't know how to articulate this, right? Like it wasn't like I saw Selena and I was suddenly like, oh wow, there's a lot of worthiness in my heritage. It wasn't that. It was just
Right.
like this instant recognition that this these markers of identity that for so long, for the entirety of my childhood, I had been sort of fed this message that I should hide them. That like, yeah, they're cool with my cousins, but when I go to school and when I'm out in the world, um, the rest of the world doesn't really think my hoops are beautiful and that like my hair is beautiful and that my music and that my cumbias and that my Spanglish accent is beautiful. So I should sort of kind of just shrink and not take up so much space and not gather so much attention. Um, and then here was Selena, you know, blooming,
Yeah.
resplendent, taking up space, not apologizing, not shrinking, not contextualizing, not contorting, not trying to justify, simply existing with an open heartedness, with a joyfulness. Um, and that was just sort of such a piercing message, of course. And so, yeah, like because of that, that was incredibly revolutionary.
Thank you. Yeah, and I feel like I feel like a lot of us are still kind of, we reflect on what she was doing during her time. And I feel like we see so many things happen, and every year, we have this 214 Selena Festival, but we also see, the Netflix series. We see celebrations coming up. We see, our modern pop stars influenced by Selena doing covers of her music, her songs at concerts. And so, again, in understanding that she is still very much alive in our culture today and still is an inspiration to so many of us. I always take those moments to kind of reflect on just how open and free and, you know, just kind of unapologetic she was with such grace. Because, yes, she was a woman singer in America, part of a culture that is already riddled with, male chauvinism and machista attitudes about what a woman should be doing in that culture. And again, those are complicated and complex discussions that can, offshoot into several other things. But the reality of Selena's existence within these sets of circumstances just add to the overpowering effort that she did almost with ease, with minimum effort. Um, and I think it's important to really look at someone like Selena through a variety of lenses, because there was so much truth and just raw spirit of who she was as an individual, that we start to see where her influences lead. We start to see, Drake wearing shirts of Selena on, Selena on the shirt, and Selena making it into the bar of a rap song, and so many other things around the world. And I always mention that at one of our events, a few years ago, we had a couple from Colombia who they got married, but they met over their love of Selena. They have matching tattoos, and their honeymoon was to come to Dallas for the 214 Selena Festival because they wanted to be around people that had the same kind of, appreciation, adoration, and love for her music and who she was. And so I always mention that to a lot of the people that I talk to, because I say, yes, she meant a lot to the community that she was from and that she was a part of, but there was so much more. There was so many other communities, and yes, primarily Mexican American, but we've seen it gone international. When you talk about Selena, it's so much more than just our backyard here in Texas. Um, and so I'd like to talk a little bit about, we mentioned belonging in this country. What are your thoughts on the idea of what she represents outside of the US and outside of Mexico, really?
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, yeah, she's an international star for sure. And she was in life too. Like I said, she had crossed over not just into Mexico, but she was performing in Puerto Rico and El Salvador. And, she was becoming, a Latin American star for sure. Um, you know, well, something interesting happens, right? Something really fascinating. One is she's already an international star in her life, beyond the US and Mexico. She's a rising global pop star before she passes. And then when she passes, her death then becomes this sort of like generational, once in a lifetime, Kennedy-esque event, right? The sort of like moment of collective mourning for Latinos. And like I said, this was a very specific moment in media history in Latinos. Latinos were not visible in the American mainstream media. We just were not, and like I said, when we were sort of reduced to this like caricature of the white gays, the dropouts, the teenage moms, the cholos and the gangsters. No shade to the cholos. We all love the cholos. But they were sort of like overrepresented in the like white American imagination of Latinos. And so, but for the most part, other than the sort of like caricatures, um, Latinos were invisible in mass media. And so suddenly, when Selena passes, and there are these droves and droves of people on the street in every major city in the United States. I'm not just talking about the Southwest. Her death was huge, headline making news on the East Coast, even in places in the Midwest. And so suddenly, um, the news of her passing makes the Latino contingency in this country very visible, much to the discomfort of other constituencies in this country.
Mhm.
We see that, for example, in the coverage immediately after her death, right? In the way Howard Stern covered, Latinos out in the street mourning Selena. It becomes a sort of like moment, first of all, of astonishment, like, oh my God, these people are actually here, and oh my God, these people actually have like whole icons and culture that we don't know about. And then it sort of becomes like this moment of ridicule too, right? um, and when Selena is publicly ridiculed by Howard Stern and sort of like other small moments of coverage surrounding her death, then what do Latinos do? They sort of come together as a block to defend her collectively. Um, and we're not just talking about Mexicans, these were Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. Like I said, in her life, she was becoming an emerging global pop star in Latin American world. And so then what happens is that this sort of neo pan Latino identity starts forming in sort of the mainstream American imagination, specifically around Selena's image. And I argue in the podcast that that is actually one of the most seminal moments for the formation of what we now called modern Latinidad. Um, for, you know, love it or hate it, for the good and for the bad of many things in this country. The sort of like formation of what we now consider, you know, modern Latino identity, modern Latinidad, and everything that sort of surrounds it. And then the biopic gets rolling almost immediately. She dies 1995. The biopic is out by 1997. And throughout those 2 years, there's like hardcore coverage of who's going to play Selena. Oh my God. And then J-Lo gets chosen. And as a Puerto Rican, you know, she sort of, she reconciles this idea that there is something in Selena that is recognized and that is experienced by all Latinos and not just Mexicans, and that her Puerto Rican identity is legitimate enough, right? Latino enough. Then it stops being about the narrative stops being about, you know, Selena simply as a Mexican American woman, but Selena as the ultimate Latina. You know, Selena as a symbol and a
Sorry,
I
what
like those
just
glasses.
happened?
Selena as a symbol and a sort of like convening icon for this emerging identity in this new moment of American politics. Um, and, you know, of course, there was some controversy, and initially people were like, "Oh my God, can J-Lo really play Selena?" You know, but very soon, this sort of idea of this overarching Latino identity sort of wins the narrative, and it's no longer about sort of cultural specificity, but more about like this emerging sort of like pan identity. And then, of course, you know, enter the Latin boom, and then, you know, Latina magazine, and we get really into that in the podcast, and this sort of like this formation of this like, you know, this identity partly born of marketing and pandering, and then you get sort of like the modern Latinidad. Yeah.
So, I'm gonna tie all of this back to you as an individual, Maria, and your kind of role at Futuro Studios. And with the success of the Anything for Selena podcast and these kinds of conversations and ideas that really go into depth about, you know, modern Latinidad, where are we going as a culture, as an identity, as part of a, you know, a bigger whole. Um, how do you feel that that informs your work specifically as a, you know, as a Latina in media at Futuro Studios and a contributor to the ever evolving culture of today?
Um, you know, I don't really think about Latinidad as a guiding force in my life. In fact, I kind of divest from that idea. You know, I think, you know, Latinidad has been co-opted, and like I said, even from the beginning, was I do think there were like very real moments of like collective identity that went into the formation of Latinidad. I also think there were like also just like weird, cheesy marketing moments of like, you know, sort of like white execs trying to pander to suddenly like this new consumer base and trying sort of to define it. um, Here's what I know to be true and what serves to me as my guiding light in my work. Instead of thinking about a story in terms of like, oh, will this capture the imagination of, you know, most Latinos, or does this fit into sort of Latinidad? Like I said, I divest from those ideas.
Right.
What I know to be true as a storyteller is that specificity breeds universality.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is that somebody's very specific individual story, the details in those stories, um, can resonate with someone of a completely different background because of the sort of like universal human feelings and universal themes in various circumstances, right? So, for example, in anything for Selena, my story is very culturally specific. You know,
Mhm.
I like to tell stories that are about like, and I'm talking about like me personally,
Right.
not necessarily like the stories that I approve at Futuro Studios and I edit, which I love to do, but me as like an individual storyteller, I like to, I like to write about my family. My next podcast is it's very similar to anything for Selena, but it's about another artist. Not contractually allowed to say yet, but it's all about family and my background. I like to write about the women in my life. I like to write about, you know, love. I like to write about when I'm in love. I like to write about um, my beautiful beloved desert, the Southwest and the land here that like speaks to me in a very sort of culturally specific way. My family has been in the Chihuahuan desert that we know of for at least 8 generations. I love this land. And so I like to write about things that are very specific to my experience as a first generation fronteriza woman. But because I write from a place of being honest with myself, right? Being true about the things, staying in my lane, about the things that are true in my life. Um, that specificity breeds universality, and there are listeners who listen to the podcast who didn't grow up in the desert, maybe have never been to the desert, or who didn't grow up on the border, who aren't queer, right, but who heard my love for the land in the podcast, and that made them think of the way they love a river close to their house or a mountain close to their house. They heard my parents talk about starting a new life in the US, and it made them think about, their grandparents moving somewhere new generations ago. And so, I don't think about like Latinidad in storytelling. I think about these unique, like very personal, specific experiences and writing about them from a place of honesty and vulnerability and allowing yourself to be to write about the stuff that scares you, because when you do that you will speak to an audience far beyond um like the audience in like your immediate community, you know.
Yeah. If I'm, it fills me with joy to hear you say that. I mean, this idea of specificity breeds universality. I think it's important to acknowledge how potent that message is, because I agree with you, and I do think that kind of getting there can be a journey to that level of understanding. And here at the Oak Cliff Cultural Center, we're a small team, but I always like to brag on our team because I feel like we really do some great work for the community. But a lot of it, we are also a city facility, right? We are in the Office of Arts and Culture for the city of Dallas. So we are public employees. At the end of all of what we do, we are at the mercy of, this big municipality, this structure of procedures and rules and things that, kind of help guide our work. And that can be very challenging when we talk about the nature of our work, which is arts and culture. Art can be subjective, and there are people that have to have an understanding of it to be able to say, we are going to present these programs, we are going to have these conversations, we are going to provide these experiences, these resources for the community because they're significant for these reasons. Or we might not have any reasons at all. At the end of it all, we're not just a building that says, hey, it's February, we're going to do Black History Month programming. Hey, it's mid September through mid October, we have to do, Hispanic heritage or um, Latin programming. And again, it's not to say that these things are not important, because celebrating culture and heritage in our community is very important and it's part of what we do. But at the end of it all, I think it's also not going to be one of those things that you mentioned in terms of being a driving force. And so I have a joke that I say here in the office often, that I say, oh, I have to wear my Mexican shirt today, and I just say, whatever shirt I'm wearing, because I'm Mexican. And so me wearing it makes it Mexican, right? And so it's like, we're not going to go out and say, hey, you're Mexican, we need you for the Cinco de Mayo parade. But we understand what the Batalla de Puebla meant. And we will take that into consideration regarding the kinds of things that we provide the public. So, yes, we're a public building, but we also understand nuance and the significance of things like the Anything for Selena podcast, and who Selena was. And, you know, if your uncle looks down on you because you don't speak Spanish, that doesn't mean that you're not Mexican or Latino. How far can we take that conversation? Because Spanish was, it's a colonial language. So what are we really talking about? And so I do appreciate you saying that, because I do think it's important to say, yes, there's information here, but specificity breeds universality. And I think at the end of it all, when we in arts and culture focus on the human condition and the community that we're a part of, I think that when we have discussions like this one, we can really go far together. So thank you for that. Before we go to one of my last questions, or my last question, I want to open it up to anybody that might be watching. If you all have any questions and you want to leave them in the comments section, we'll try to get to them. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We have only a few minutes left, but my last thing was going to be, and I know that we can't talk completely about some of the things, but what can we expect in the future from you? I know you said you were working on a podcast, but there are other things that you're kind of looking forward to creatively or just in general.
Yeah, yeah. We actually just launched a podcast yesterday at Futuro Studios. It's really different territory for us. I Several months ago, I was like, oh my God, imagine if we could create a podcast where a really like amazing astrologer could sit down with like our favorite artists and thinkers and musicians, excuse me, and read them their birth chart. Um, and yeah, and that podcast came true. We've partnered with Sirius and
Oh,
Stitcher, and it's called
cool.
Stars and Stars with Isa, and it's a beautiful podcast. I'm a big astrology girly.
Yeah.
I Yeah, astrology is like a big sort of like guiding force in my life. But it's, even if you're not into astrology, it's a beautiful podcast because Isa, our astrologer, is an amazing interviewer, and the artists who come on with her like get very vulnerable and real, and sometimes they cry, and it's just like these like really cathartic conversations.
Mm.
And so she mixes sort of like reading their birth chart and what the sky and the stars say about like their purpose in life with an interview. I edit that podcast, and that's so beautiful. And then me personally, I'm going to be super careful about what I can say, but I recently finished a podcast, and we're sort of waiting on some administrative loose ends to come together to publish it.
Okay.
It is kind of like the sequel to Anything for
Okay.
Selena. It's about another artist that like deeply not only shaped me, but shaped, frankly, like my lineage and my
Mm.
family. And so that podcast um, is all about, whereas Selena, I was really trying to figure out, where I belong in this country. This podcast is all about going back to my
Mm.
roots and thinking about where I come from and all the people and the forces that came before me that shaped me. So it's about this artist, but it's also about, my cultural lineage. And I hope to be able to announce and publish it very, very soon. We're just
Well, we'll be
there's some loose
listening.
ends.
I know Martin D. Wilkins is saying, I remember you expressing a desire to make a podcast about Juanga. Whoever it is, I will be listening. And I would have to concur. I think, you kind of talking about it and knowing what you did with the Selena podcast. I think the community will most definitely be listening to, whenever you do get around to publishing that. And then we do have a question from Kelly D. The Cool. They asked, would you say that Selena symbolism, what she stood for, is very important in this day and age?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Her message remains as potent today as it did in the 90s, right? This sort of idea that you can ascend in American society without contorting to the white gaze, without compromising who you are, remains as necessary a message now as ever. Completely. And when I see somebody wearing like a Selena shirt, I don't just think like, oh, that person likes Selena too. Like I think like, there's still like it's like I said, her image has become this sort of like whistle,
Yes.
this sort of private whistle that like this person and you share
Yes.
some common understanding of the world, that like that this person sort of understands you and sees you in a way that others don't. And so I think, yeah, her
Yeah.
symbolism remains as potent as ever.
I agree with you. I think once once I guess the entirety, or not the entirety, but um, once many of us started to see her image, it was like, oh, we know this look. We know who this person is. I have a cousin, a tia, that reminds me of this person. And then to realize that, there is this identity solidified in who she is as a singer, but so much more than that. Yeah, it does kind of create like this language within language of, hey, we get it. We're on the same page.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So this will be the last call for any questions. If you're watching and you would like to ask a question to Maria Garcia, feel free to drop it in the comments. I'll give you all 30 seconds. But before before we kind of close out, I do want to just give a quick reminder to anyone that's watching. And if you're in the Dallas, North Texas area, this is the official kickoff for the 214 Selena Festival. We have events Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Make sure you check out Loteria Night. We have the art show. We have the film screening. We have the cumbia party. We have the big Selena market with the talent contest at the Latino Cultural Center on Saturday. And of course, Selena Sunday over at Top 10 Records. We have a ton of special guests with us. It's going to be a great time. Just about every single event is free and open to the public. There are a couple of things that are paid, like the film screening and the after party. But yes, for more information, make sure you follow 214 Selena here on Instagram. And then one final question that we'll go with from Martin D. Wilkins. Is there a way Selena has transcended as a cultural figure that young Maria would never have imagined?
Oh, by the way, my cousin just wrote, I just want to say I'm so proud of you, Maria Garcia. Love you. Oh, thank you, Martha.
Props to
I
the
love you
prima.
too. I love it when my primas join a live. Um, surprisingly, no, and I'll tell you why. Um, I am not surprised by the by the milestones Selena reaches after her death, because I think she would have reached even higher in her life. I just genuinely believe that. I don't know if you remember, but when Beyonce started, it was very similar to Selena in the way that, for example, Beyonce was managed by her dad, and you know she had also a very sort of squeaky clean image in the beginning, and and then as she started to evolve as an artist and grow into her own, she sort of emancipated herself, and she grew into her sort of more maturing image, and she started having more of a say in how she wanted to present herself, the music she wanted to do. And I think we would have seen that in Selena. Like, we forget that, yes, Selena had started when she was 9 years old. And so it's not that she was in the infancy of her career, but she was only 23, you know? And so, and she wanted to be a star forever. And I don't think she would have let go of music, at least not for a couple more decades. Like, I think we would have seen her sort of really come into her own, and we would have seen her take over the world. Like, all these things that we see J Lo and Beyonce doing, Selena would have been doing. But I believe, like, an even grander scale,
Mm.
she would be sort of the grand dame of like these mega pop stars. And so I'm not surprised when I see new milestones. It does sort of take me aback sometimes when I'm like, oh my God, I know she was, like I said, becoming a global pop star, but for many years in my childhood, she was sort of a regional star, right? She was a
Mhm.
Tejana.
Mhm.
And so we knew her in northern Mexico and Texas. Um, and so it's still like, it still trips me out when I see uh, her image on like t-shirts at Target, and I'm like, oh my God, this woman who was sort of our regional queen is now like queen of the world. But she would have been even bigger in life, you know?
Yes, I have to agree, and I think, as a community, as heartbroken as we still are, I think we are almost equally, if not more so, just inspired and overfilled with joy, realizing, the memories that she's left us with, who she was as a person and her music. Yes. Whew, man, what a way to end the conversation. Very powerful. Thank you again. Yeah, so a big shout out. Thank you to our special guest, Maria Garcia. Again, Maria, we appreciate your time and contributions to the culture. Please make sure you all check out the Anything for Selena podcast if you haven't already, along with all of the great work happening at Futuro Studios. We are looking forward to the upcoming projects that you have. We're excited to see what happens next. And again, if you're in the North Texas area, make sure you make it out to some of the 214 Selena Festival events. But we cannot thank you enough. Thank you to all of the people saying thank you. We appreciate you. We have Omar Narvaez. Thank you, Council. We have A Scribe. Hey, Andrea, Stella, Jess, Martin D. Wilkins. Again, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Maria. We appreciate this so much. And yeah, we'll keep our eyes open for your next project.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation. Thank you for thinking
No,
about me, and I hope
of course.
all the events go beautifully. They sound really wonderful.
It's much appreciated. Thank you again. You have a
You
good one.